Thank you, Paris. Well, I'm sure you might have heard of inflation, but do you really understand the meaning of it? Inflation is when prices are persistently rising, although it doesn't mean they are all rising at the same rate. Some could be falling, some could be rapidly increasing, and some could be increasing at a fairly steady rate. But the average of all these elements, if they are rising, is called inflation. Inflation could also be described where the value of money is falling. When prices rise, you can buy less with your money, and the demand for goods and services will decrease. For example, if you had £1 and you wanted to buy 2 packets of gum, before the rise in inflation, they'd each be 50p, and you'd only be able to afford 2. Say inflation rose by 2%, the price of gum would increase by 1p, so they'd now be 51p each. If you only had £1, it means that you would only be able to afford one of them now, or you would have to go for a cheaper substitute. This is an example to show you how the value of your money decreases because you can buy less. A good inflation rate considered by many governments is from 0 to 4%, and this is because it allows a country to develop but still makes sure that it's sustainable. Deflation is when there's a decrease in price. The value of money increases, and it is usually displayed as a minus number. This happens in a recession like there is now. The prices are lowered because they need the demand to increase. Disinflation, however, is where inflation is slowly decreasing, so it could drop from 4% to 3%, but it is still at a good rate. And hyperinflation is where the prices are rapidly increasing by over 50%. Now let's move on to the effects of inflation. The first effect of inflation is that when inflation begins, it does tend to accelerate because people anticipate the future rise in prices. The firms may raise their prices to cover past and expected future costs. This will speed up rates of inflation. Inflation also affects the distribution of income. When inflation happens, people try to obtain an increase in their income to compensate for the rise in prices. Some people will manage, and some will be unsuccessful. Some trade unions may be more successful at arguing their case than others, and this can lead to a larger gap between people's incomes. Another effect of inflation is that borrowers gain at the expense of lenders. This basically means that when someone borrows money and inflation happens, the money that they repay back is of less value, and that means that they, in theory, pay back less. For example, if someone borrowed £1,000 at the start of the year and the price increases, then the £1,000 will buy less than what it previously would when it was borrowed. Finally, inflation affects the balance of payments. If inflation causes the price of goods in the country to rise above the price in competing countries, then there will be harmful effects on the balance of payments. It will cause a deficit, which Larissa, our correspondent, will cover later in the programme. Imports into the country will become cheaper, and with the country's own goods not being bought in their own country, and in others too, because of the expense, then the government will suffer. Now we are going to look at causes of inflation. It is thought that inflation is caused by 3 main factors: demand pull, cost push, and monetary. Okay, demand pull inflation. This is when there's been an increase in aggregate demand. Now, my colleague Paris earlier explained what aggregate demand was, and we know this is the demand of the whole country. Consumer spending and government spending cause an increase in aggregate demand. This happens when the economy is fully employed because spending increases, so aggregate demand increases because the country's demand increases. The firms then need to hire more workers, and employment, as a result, increases, so the resources are fully employed, and therefore we can't supply anymore. This in turn raises the prices of the goods because the goods become scarce and less of them exist, and this causes inflation. Another cause of inflation is cost-push inflation, and this is where the price of the raw materials, the labour, the indirect tax, or a fall in exchange rate pushes the cost of goods up and leads to inflation. And finally, monetary inflation. This depends on the supply of money and at the rate at which the money changes hands. Basically, if £1 changes hands 4 times, the amount spent will have been £4, but the amount of money is still £1. The amount of spending affects the price and then leads to inflation. So if the rate of circulation of the money is quick, then it will lead to inflation. Now that we understand inflation and the causes of inflation, I really want to focus on why the government wants to control it. For you to get a good idea of why they want to control inflation in the first place is to understand what happens when it gets out of control. When there is inflation, it is caused by spending, and a lot of spending means that consumers have a really large disposable income, and it has increased. The aggregate demand for the country increases, so then inflation rises. When inflation happens, prices are rising, and to cover that, workers are asking for higher salaries to compensate the higher price of living. When the companies give the workers higher salaries, the companies have to also cover the costs by either laying off workers or increasing the price of their goods or services. By increasing the prices, this leads to more inflation, which leads to unemployment because workers need to be made redundant because of the continuous increase in prices that the workers demand higher wages for. Unemployment leads to recession, and this is never good for a country. The government's aim is to control inflation, and to do this they have to either decrease their spending or raise the income tax. By raising the income tax, you decrease the consumer's disposable income, so that people can earn less and then they spend less. When spending decreases, aggregate demand decreases, and this allows the inflation rate to go down. Government spending increases the amount of employment in the country, and when a country has high employment, then people have money to spend on goods, which then leads to inflation. If the inflation rises too high, the governments can limit their spending or decrease the amount they spend, and this will decrease the number of jobs. When people have less disposable income, aggregate demand for the country goes down, and inflation will then go down in turn with that too. This is called fiscal policy. Hopefully you've been given an insight into inflation, the causes and the effects, and what the government can do to decrease or increase it. Next, my colleague Paris is going to be explaining unemployment to you. Thank you.